WNYC Studios is supported by Grubhub. Sometimes getting to a so-called convenience store isn't actually very convenient. But now Grubhub delivers from local convenience stores. Whether you're in the market for snacks, paper towels, or drinks, Grubhub delivers them right from the convenience store to your door.
It can make a singer go silent and keep a boy from growing tall. Stress. On Radiolab. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
This is The Takeaway with Melissa Harris Perry from WNYC and PRX in collaboration with WGBH Radio in Boston.
On December 8th, 2021, President Biden assured the public there would be no American ground forces fighting in Ukraine.
We have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to our NATO allies. If they were to attack under Article 5, it's a sacred obligation. That obligation does not extend to to Ukraine.
On January 25th, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki re-emphasized the point.
Just to be clear, there is no intention or interest or desire by the president to send troops to Ukraine.
On February 2nd, President Biden did approve deployment of 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe, but Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby reiterated,
"These forces are not going to fight in Ukraine."
So on Monday, the Kremlin ordered Russian forces into Ukraine, and despite repeated efforts to reach a diplomatic solution, tensions are rising rather than settling. But the Biden administration has been consistent for months. American troops will not fight in Ukraine. So just what does the world plan to do as Russia stands ready to invade a sovereign nation?
I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday. These have been closely coordinated with our allies and partners and will continue to escalate sanctions if Russia escalates.
With me is Jacob Kierkegaard, who is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and German Marshall Fund. Jacob, welcome to The Takeaway.
My pleasure.
So sanctions seem to be the primary tool that we have at our disposal. What is the history of the efficacy of sanctions?
I think when it comes to deterring a major economy and military power like Russia from doing something that its leadership wants to do, that track record is very poor. Typically, sanctions, economic sanctions is something that may have an effect on smaller economies. It tends to work only in the medium to long run. And if it's to have any real effect, they need to be global in scope, in the sense that they will typically have to be enforced or imposed by the UN Security Council, not just the United States with its key European allies.
Now, in 2014, that's exactly the group, the U.S. and our allies imposed sanctions on Russia during the annexation of Crimea. When we look at that moment in 2014, can we say, well, they were effective there because he did not, in fact, invade eastern Ukraine?
No, I think the lesson from 2014 is that sanctions against Russia have had very little effect on deterring the actions of Vladimir Putin. Yes, the sanctions did target some of his inner circles, some of the Russian banks. Yes, they did lower overall trade, particularly between Russia and the EU. But it's clear that the sort of codependence between certainly the EU, many members of the EU and Russia when it comes to natural gas, but also the role of Russia as one of the largest oil producers in the world on the global oil markets, that energy was not included in the sanctions in 2014. They haven't been so far this time either. And unless that happens, you're not going to have a major immediate impact on the Russian economy. But of course, if we choose to do that, you would certainly see energy prices rise much further in the EU, and quite likely also see a further upward hike on gas prices in the United States.
So, Jacob, you were making this point before the break about the likelihood that the most effective sanctions would also create, potentially higher prices at the gas pump for Americans. going into a midterm election season. So I'm wondering, is there any possibility that those more effective sanctions would be put into place, given that, very real, not only economic, but political reality that the Biden administration would face?
No, I think unfortunately the reality is that the energy sector is probably not going to be included in those sanctions. There are also other types of sanctions that the US government has at its disposal that could be, maybe not in the immediate, but certainly in the medium term, be quite potentially painful for the Russian economy. One of them is export controls. And there, the US government has the ability to deny Russian access to technology in the IT sector, high tech, etc., chips, and the like. That's what was used against some of the Chinese companies like Huawei earlier. And that would, I think, have an effect. You could also completely block out the Russian financial sector, Russian individuals from the global financial system by denying it access to the SWIFT network of money transactions, etc. But again, the Russian economy today is probably more resilient against certainly financial sanctions than it were in 2014. So again, I would be skeptical that these would seriously deter Vladimir Putin's course of action in the Ukraine.
Could sanctions hurt or harm the Russian people and their lived experience on a day-to-day basis, though?
Well, there's always this trade-off or internal conflict when you impose wide-ranging economic sanctions on a country or a government, because typically you do it against dictatorships like Russia right now, and that means that it's often the case that you or us as the international community or the West, if you like, probably care more about the economic circumstances and welfare of the average Russian than arguably the Russian government itself. Because I don't think there's any doubt that if you were to impose further wide-ranging economic sanctions on Russia, it would have potentially significant negative effects also on the average living standards of Russians. But of course, given the authoritarian nature of the Russian government, these Russian citizens wouldn't have the capacity to make their displeasure known through any sort of meaningful electoral process. So there's always a trade-off between the welfare of the average person and your desire to affect the actions of a government.
Right. And that's exactly the asymmetry, right, that Putin understands that President Biden is facing, is that President Biden is, in fact, beholden to U.S. public opinion through elections, not only for himself, but for his party in the midterm elections. Whereas that, as you point out, that is not the circumstance that Vladimir Putin is facing as he leads Russia. If troops are truly off the table and sanctions seem unlikely to shift the balance of calculation for Vladimir Putin in the short term, are there any effective tools left in our toolbox for stopping this invasion?
I'm not sure that there is any effective tools. If Russia or Vladimir Putin has decided to attack Ukraine, he's probably going to do it. But certainly it is within our capacity to affect that calculation, not necessarily by economic sanctions, but by arming and preparing Ukraine. Because Ukraine is a large country. It has a really large and battle-hardened army. So even if the Russian forces are undoubtedly better equipped and more numerous, this isn't going to be a walk in the park.
Jacob Kierkegaard, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
This week on The Experiment, Atlantic editor Dan Engber has spent months with rehab engineer James Sulzer.
I went into this to build devices to help people, but I never considered that building devices might not be the answer.
Now he tinkers away, trying to help his daughter Livy regain brain function.
It's really easy as a scientist to poo-poo everything and be skeptical. But as a parent, you need to have some optimism and you need to have leaps of faith.
Listen to The Experiment wherever you get podcasts.